Morning everyone and welcome to the committee's 32nd meeting in 2020. Could I ask all those present please and those remotely please to make sure your mobile phones are on silent. The meeting will be conducted in a hybrid format with some of our members participating remotely. The first agenda item is a decision on taking business in private. The committee is asked to consider taking items 12 and 13 in private. This is to allow the committee to review the evidence heard on the Salmon Farming Scotland inquiry update and to consider a letter from the Finance Committee on the implications of Brexit on devolution. Are members agreed? We are agreed. We'll then move on, therefore, to agenda item 2, which is the sift of 3 Brexit-related affirmative instruments as detailed on the agenda. The Scottish Government has allocated the affirmative procedure to all 3 SSIs. Is the committee agreed that it is content with the parliamentary procedure allocated to the instruments by the Scottish Government? We are agreed. Therefore, we'll move on to agenda item 3, which is subordinate legislation and instruments. This item is to consider 2 affirmative instruments as detailed on the agenda. The committee will take evidence on the Plant Health EU Exit Scotland Amendment, Regulations 2020, and the Trade in Animals Related Products EU Scotland Amendment, Regulations 2020. The motion seeking for the approval of the affirmative instruments will be considered at items 4 and 5. Members would please note there have been no representations to the committee on these instruments. Now, just as this relates to animals and the trade in animals and plant health, I'm just going to formally note that my register of interest that I'm a member of a farming partnership in Murray. I think Peter wants to make a similar declaration. Peter.
Indeed, Convener, I would declare a membership of a farming partnership in Aberdeenshire.
Thank you. And Stuart, I think you would also want to make a declaration.
Thank you, Convener. I'm a joint owner of a very small registered agricultural holding from which I derive no income.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And I'd now like to welcome from the Scottish Government, Murray Gougeon, the Minister for Rural Affairs and Natural Environment, Rachel Coutts, a lawyer, John Spears, the Senior Policy Advisor, Keith White, also a lawyer, and Jesus Gallego, the Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer for the Scottish Government. Minister, would you like to make a brief opening statement on the 2 SIs? Minister.
I would you like me to do them at the same time or just go through the Plant Health SSI first?
I think we'll do it in 2 bits. We'll do the first one on plant health and then take any questions, and then the second one, if that's all right, Minister, just makes it easier for the record. Minister.
No problem. And what I will do is then just give a brief overview of what we're trying to do with these regulations. So the purpose of the draft regulations is to revoke and remake EU exit provisions relating to plant and tree health to ensure that we maintain and continue to protect Scotland's agriculture, our forestry and horticulture sectors, as well as the wider environment from pests and diseases when Scotland leaves the European Union. So the committee will recall that the Forestry EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2019 and the Plant Health EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2019 were drafted last year in the event that we were looking at a no deal in March 2019. Now, these instruments were laid before the introduction of the new EU plant health and official controls regime that became applicable in December last year, and that means that they now need to be revoked. The 2020 regulations deficiency fix the new domestic regime to come into force for the 1st of January 2021, and they also make provision to update domestic plant health legislation before it becomes a retained EU law. The changes made by these are necessary to ensure that the current domestic plant health legislation continues to operate effectively after the end of the transition period. Our legislation also has to be efficient to ensure that any associated burdens on business are going to be proportionate. And the 2020 regulations introduce a provision in relation to import fees, which will only be in effect from IP completion day until the 31st of March 2021. So by allowing the 2020 regulations to pass, this gives reassurance to anyone associated or interested in the plant health sectors that we are committed to protecting Scotland from pests and diseases that are not known to occur here. And that's where I'd be happy to take any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you very much, Minister. We're just having a slight issue with technology, not that we can work through it though. So my question is to members, does anyone have any questions on the plant health points that the Minister's introduced? No, I'm not seeing any questions. So, Minister, could I ask you then, please, to make comment on the second SI, which is the Trade in Animals and Related Products regulations. Minister.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the primary purpose of this SSI is to ensure that we have a functioning system of controls on imports of live animals, products of animal origin, germinal products and animal byproducts following the UK's withdrawal from the EU and the end of the transition period. And this should also be read in conjunction with the official controls, Animals Feed and Food, Plant Health Amendment, EU Exit Regulations 2020, that I think the committee has already had the opportunity to scrutinise and which is currently undergoing passage through the UK Parliament. The committee will be aware that it's the intention of the Scottish Government, along with other administrations, to align with current EU legislation and EU-derived domestic legislation as fully as possible and where practicable and appropriate. And the Scottish Government, along with other administrations, therefore plan to retain the current rules set out in EU legislation and EU-derived domestic legislation on official controls carried out to verify compliance with these rules in order to protect human and animal health. So this instrument is necessary in order to ensure that appropriate official controls are carried out on animals and products entering Scotland from a third country, so as to protect human and animal health following the UK's withdrawal from the EU. Now, the regulations as framed are principally concerned with technical changes to the regulations and to ensure that controls on imports of live animals and animal products verify that imported goods continue to meet the specific import conditions that are laid down in retained EU law. And the changes to the regulations will also reflect that the UK is no longer a member state and that third country controls will be applied to imported goods from the EU in a phased way. And this approach has also been adopted by other administrations in order to ensure that we have a consistent GB-wide approach. So on this basis, it's therefore considered necessary that these changes are made in order to secure continuation of that effective regime for official controls on the trade in animals and animal-related products, and essentially to provide that continuity of business on EU exit. So I hope that provides members of the committee with sufficient assurance as to why the changes are being made and why the Scottish Government deems them necessary. So again, both myself and my officials would be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Minister. There are a few questions. I'm going to go to Mike Rumbles to start with. Mike.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. In the explanatory notes, it says Regulation 2 of these regulations makes amendments to the trade in animals and related products, that's the trade, and again in the policy note, the purpose of the instrument is to make changes to the trade in animals and related products. And so far, I can only see the emphasis on imports and not exports, and I assume trade means both. And while I fully understand the regulatory need for regulatory change for the imports, and therefore I don't see anything wrong with the instrument, but I'm curious as to why, when we're talking about trade in animals, it's focused on imports and no mention of exports.
In response to that, I mean, that is why this instrument has been needed, because obviously, well, I talked about the other regulations that are in place, and this SSI is needed to give effect to the official controls regulations, and to give effect to the phased process that we've set out. Because as of the 1st of January, if we didn't have the phased approach in place and we didn't set out the system in relation to imports, we would face full checks on everything being imported into GB from that point. So that's why this SSI is necessary, because it gives effect to that wider regime that has been put in place through the official controls regulation. So we needed to have this SSI brought forward to give effect to that.
Please, could I follow that up, please?
Absolutely. I'm just delighted that we've now got all the screens working and I can actually see them. She seems to have dropped off, but is back in force. So, Mike, back to you.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Minister, as well. I mean, I understand all that. That's what it says in the policy. And that wasn't my question. My question is not focused on the imports. And we need this, and I absolutely agree with the Minister. But it doesn't. It talks about the trade in the explanatory notes, and it talks about the trade in the policy notes. But the actual SSI doesn't mention the trade, the both-way trades. And I understand the importance of imports. The question I asked the Minister was, there's no mention of exports. I wondered why. Is there a need? Is the answer to my question the fact that we don't need to mention exports? That's what I'd like to know. Or if there is a need to mention it, why hasn't it been mentioned?
Minister, do you want, I can't see the screen. I wondered if you wanted to bring in one of your advisors on that particular subject.
Okay, that's fine. Well, what I can do is, I mean, I'd just like to answer Mike Rumble's briefly, and then Jesus, my official, can come in with further information.
The importance of muting your phone when you're remote, as well as in the committee meeting. I don't know who that is, but I'm not going to point any fingers. But Minister, surely not you.
No, it definitely wasn't me, but I thought I should probably wait until the noise had died down before I continued. Well, it's just that the EU has already set out its position in effect. I mean, that's why we've seen so much concern from industry in Scotland about what's going to be needed for exporting goods. We've taken a phased approach in relation to imports as to what comes into GP, purely because this is a position we've had to adopt, because we wouldn't have the infrastructure in place otherwise to be able to be ready on day one. But that's where businesses that are exporting face serious issues because, well, first of all, they don't know what trade agreements might be in place, but all the controls that we're looking at phasing in for imports, they will face as of the 1st of January when they export to the EU. So that's where you've seen from Scotland Food and Drink, they wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister about asking for a 6-month grace period in relation to having to provide export health certificates because of the regulatory and obviously the burden that puts on businesses when they've been dealing with the COVID situation. So I hope I've been able to make that clear. So in terms of the phase checks here, we've done that so that we can manage imports in as best a way as we can, given the situation that we're in. But the EU checks will be applied as of the 1st of January. So we didn't need the legislation here because that's what's been put in place through official controls regulation. So I don't know if Jesus has anything further to add to that.
Who would like to come in? Sorry.
Thank you, Minister. It's Jesus Gallego, Deputy Chief Vet in Animal Health and Welfare Division. To clarify the situation with exports, this instrument is only part of the full range of different pieces of legislation that deal with international trade in products of animal origin. As the Minister mentioned earlier, there's another instrument, the Official Controls Animals, Feed and Food, Plant Health, etc. Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2020, which is a UK instrument that includes matters of devolved competency and which has already gone through passed through the Scottish Parliament and it's now in UK Parliament. There are provisions dealing with trade in that instrument as well, both primarily with imports like this one, but any changes that are required in legislation for exports is on the official controls regulations, which are amended by this other instrument. But the fact really is that for exports, rules on how to trade from the UK to the EU are primarily made by the EU. and we have relatively little in terms of legislation in place to implement that. We implement export controls administratively or through the powers that we already have, because from the 1st of January, the export controls to the EU will be identical to the ones we already have for third countries. So very little is required in terms of fixing.
I think Mike's happy with that answer. Peter Chapman, I think you wanted to come in.
Yes, I mean, I'm concerned about this export question as well. I mean, we've just heard that England proposes to ban live exports from the beginning of January once we're out of the EU. And we know that there's a worry in Scotland about that principle, because we know that cattle, for instance, from Orkney and Shetland have to come south to be slaughtered. And, you know, if you open that door and say it's not a good idea to export animals across the channel at 20-odd miles of sea, but it's okay to haul them down from Shetland, which is a considerably longer distance, that it might be have a serious effect on the farming industries in the islands. So what's the Scottish Government's position on the export of live animals after 1st of January? And does this instrument have any effect on that? I mean, to follow up on Mike Rumble's question.
Okay, Minister, I'm going to ask you to be fairly tight on that, because that stretches it into exports and we're dealing with imports. So if you could just confirm if this instrument has any policy on it, and then I'd be delighted if you wanted to write to Mr. Chapman and the committee about the export issues under a separate title, because it's not part of this particular item on the agenda. Minister.
No, that's absolutely fine. I'm happy to write to the committee and give them more information on that. But in terms of what we're looking at here, that's not affected. I mean, maximum travel times, and we're not changing any policy. Maximum travel times are, you know, that's already fixed in legislation. We're not looking to change that at all. And we are taking forward other measures in relation to, there was the FOC opinion on the export of live animals, but I'm happy to write to the committee and give them further information on that. But in relation to any further policy changes, we're not looking at that as part of this instrument.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Minister, for confirming that. Are there any other members of the committee that want to ask a question? I'm not seeing anyone, therefore I'm going to propose to move on to agenda item 4. This is the formal consideration of motion S5M 23354 in the name of the Minister for Rural Affairs and Natural Environment, calling on the committee to recommend that the Plant Health EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020 draft be approved. Minister, I'd ask you to formally move the motion, please.
Formally moved.
And I'm assuming that you don't wish to make any further comments.
No, convener.
Thank you. Are there any comments from the members? The question, therefore, as there are none, is that motion S5M 23354 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Therefore, I'll move on to agenda item 5, which is the formal consideration of motion S5M 23469 in the name of the Minister for Rural Affairs and the Natural Environment, calling on the committee to recommend that the Trade in Animals and Related Products EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020 draft be approved. I would invite the Minister to move the motion and confirm that she doesn't want to make any further comments. Minister.
Formally moved and no further comments to make, convener. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any comments from the members? There is. Mike Rumbles.
Thank you, Convener. All I want to say in this debate is that since this is just confirmed by the Minister and her officials, that this is about imports and not exports, I'm certainly happy to approve it.
Okay. Does any other members have any comments? No. On the basis that this is entirely that, the question is that motion S5M 23469 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I'm not seeing any dissenting voices, therefore we are agreed. The committee will now move on. Sorry, Minister, I think that excuses you and your team at this stage. Thank you very much for the the evidence that you've given to the committee this morning. We will now move on to agenda item 6, which will be the committee taking evidence on the Common Agricultural Policy Less Favoured Area Support EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020 and the Direct Payments to Farmers Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2020. The motion seeking for the approval of the affirmative instrument will be considered at items 7 and 8. Members are please asked to note that there have been no representations to the committee on these instruments. I would like to welcome from the Scottish Government, Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Tourism, John Kerr, the Head of Agricultural Policy Division, Andrew Crawley, the lawyer for the Scottish Government Legal Directorate, and Lynn Stewart, the Head of Direct Payments, Rural Payments and Inspectorates Directorate, the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary, would you like to make a brief opening statement on the two SIs, please?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning. And I'd like to thank the committee for taking the time to consider these important regulations today and for the opportunity to address members. The regulations were laid using powers conferred by the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018 and the Agriculture Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Act 220. They ensure that payments to farmers, crofters and land managers can continue under the current Less Favoured Area Support Scheme from 2021. We need to do this as LFAS is under the current EU SRDP only intended to work in the period from 2014 to 2020. They also reverse the cuts made in 219 and 220 required by EU law. The Scottish Government did everything it could to mitigate the impact of these cuts, and I'm now very pleased to be able to set payment rates from 221 onwards at the higher 2018 rate. And it's essential that LFAS payments continue at the higher rate in order to support the Scottish rural economy during Brexit and the recovery from the COVID pandemic. The regulations also make some minor simplifications and improvements and also fix a deficiency in the LFAS rules that would otherwise have effect on IP completion day. I'm happy to, with my officials, Convener, to answer any questions that members may have.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'm just looking around at the members of the committee to see if there's any questions on that particular one. Mr. Chapman, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'm delighted to hear that you are returning LFAS monies to the level that they were at prior to the cuts that were imposed by the EU. I'm just the question I have is where the monies are coming from to reinstate the levels to LFAS.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, it's my belief and my intention that we should seek to maintain the level of LFAS at the full rate from 221 during the period until 224. In other words, my belief, my intention is that that should be the case. Now, formal decisions haven't yet been taken on that, and there's one very good reason for that, Convener, and that is that the ability of the Scottish Government to continue to pay the LFAS farmers whose work in producing food and looking after the countryside, I think, means that this is something they earn and deserve, not a subsidy, but their earnings, if you like. That's the way I look at it. But our ability to do that is dependent upon the continuance of funding that formerly was received from the EU, from the UK government. And at the moment, there are serious questions as to whether there will be a sufficiency of funding up to 224, 225, and indeed, Convener, a real concern that the UK will impose cuts in terms of failing to match what the EU would have provided to Scotland. But it is my intention to, nevertheless, despite these difficulties which have arisen, I'm afraid, just in the last few weeks from a decision unilaterally taken by the UK government to proceed to ensure that our hill farmers and those on our islands and farming the kind of more difficult land do continue to receive that support, because my approach has been one of stability and simplicity, and that forms part of the stability element, that businesses need to know where they stand, not just 1 year in farming and crofting, but multi-years. That was one of the many benefits of EU membership, where programmes were for a 7-year period, not just a year-to-year budget period. And that's one of the problems that the UK government, I'm afraid, is taking in approaching things largely on a year-to-year basis and not on that 7-year basis.
Peter.
I've got to challenge the Cabinet Secretary on what he's just said. We had George Eustace in front of this committee just last week, who confirmed that for the lifetime of the Parliament in Westminster, which is somewhere in the region of 4.5 years to go, that they would be guaranteeing £595 million coming to Scotland to support Scottish agriculture. And he also made the point that the funding in the EU is being cut by 10%, mainly because our contribution to the EU is no longer there. So to say that we would have done better within the EU than we were proposed to be doing out west, I absolutely refute that argument completely.
I'm going to get into such trouble with my colleagues for shutting this conversation down, in the sense that it is in relation to a SI which has been put forward, and the principles of it, which I think the Cabinet Secretary has alluded to. Cabinet Secretary, I will allow you very, very briefly to have a quick response, and then I'll go to any other questions, if I may.
I'm afraid Mr. Chapman is not correct. There will be a substantial reduction in funding as a result of the failure of the UK to honour its pre-Brexit promises to match EU funding. We calculate that the amount of the cuts by Westminster on Scotland will, from now to 2024, be £170 million.
And we are definitely going to leave that bit there. Are there any other questions from committee members? If there aren't, Cabinet Secretary, could I turn to you and ask you if you want to make any comments on the direct payment to farmers miscellaneous amendment, Scotland regulations? I'm very happy to allow you a brief comments on that, Cabinet Secretary.
Right, I just got a short opening statement, which I'm just locating here, if I may. These regulations were laid using powers conferred by the Agriculture Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Act 220, which received royal assent on the 1st of October this year. The Act empowers Scottish ministers to make regulations modifying the main CAP legislation to ensure that it will continue to operate effectively in Scotland beyond 220. This includes enabling the Scottish ministers to set direct payment ceilings. These regulations specify the manner in which the Scottish ministers will determine the annual total ceiling for Scotland as a part of the annual Scottish Government budget process. Our aim is to provide stability and continuity to farmers and crofters insofar as we are able to do so. The regulations also make some technical amendments to ensure operability of the existing direct payment schemes in Scotland for 2021 and subsequent claim years, and remove provisions which are spent or not in use in Scotland. Unless these regulations are approved and brought into force by the 1st of January to enable a ceiling to be determined for 2021 and for subsequent years, we will not have a basis, Convener, for making direct payments next year and beyond. To conclude, my focus now is to continue to ensure that we in government are fulfilling our role of supporting our farmers and crofters by doing all we can to ensure payments can continue to be made to them next year and in subsequent years. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Are there any committee members that wish to raise any points on that? There are not. Therefore, we'll move on to agenda item 7, which is the formal consideration of motion S5M 23419 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Tourism, calling on the committee to recommend that the Common Agricultural Policy Less Favoured Areas Support EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020 be approved. Cabinet Secretary, can I ask you to move the motion and confirm you have no further comments you wish to make. Cabinet Secretary.
So moved and no further comment.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Are there any comments that members wish to make at this stage? There are not, so therefore the question is that motion S5M 23419 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Therefore, I'd like to move on to agenda item 8, which is subordinate legislation, and this is the formal consideration of motion S5M 23264 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Tourism, calling on the committee to recommend that the direct payments to farmers miscellaneous amendments Scotland Regulations 2020 be approved. Cabinet Secretary, can I ask you please to move the motion and confirm that you don't have any further comments you wish to make?
So moved and no further comments.
Thank you so much, Cabinet Secretary. Are there any comments from any members? There are not. Therefore, the question is motion S5M 23264 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you to your officials for attending that part of the meeting. You are staying in place, though, and move on to agenda item 9, which is Salmon Farming in Scotland Inquiry Update. The committee will take further evidence on the progress towards delivering of the recommendations in its 2018 Salmon Farming in Scotland Inquiry Report. The committee will take evidence from Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy and Tourism, Alistair Mitchell, the Deputy Director of Aquaculture and Recreational Fisheries, Mike Palmer, the Deputy Director Marine Planning and Policy of the Scottish Government. Just before I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement, I would like to remind members that I have an interest in a wild salmon fishery in Murray. On that basis, Cabinet Secretary, would you like to make a brief opening statement, please? Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. Scottish aquaculture is a pivotal provider of approximately 11,700 often highly skilled jobs and livelihoods, many located in some of our most remote and fragile communities. The sector in 2019-20 took on 84 modern apprentices. An 18-year-old can expect a starting salary in the sector of around £20,000 and as an operative, and through training and experience can become a farm manager and earn £40,000. The sector pays average salaries of £38,000, significantly greater than many other jobs in remote coastal areas. We advocate sustainable growth of the sector with due regard to the environment, even whereby the 880 million it and the wider supply chain contributes to the economy, or the 1.4 billion spent annually on supplies and capital investments, mostly in Scotland. With that in mind, I want to highlight progress made since the committee's report. Firstly, the Farmed Fish Health Framework. Through this framework, we've lowered thresholds for reporting and intervention to 2 and 6 adult female lice per fish. In 2021, we will go further, convening with a reduction to 2 and 4. We are introducing legislation requiring the reporting of average sea lice weekly in arrears. The refreshed framework will turn focus on fish mortality, climate change, and the use of treatments. On interactions, we are considering our response to the Salmon Interactions Working Group report, including how implementation will be coordinated, ensuring that recommendations are prioritised where appropriate. We will consult in the new year on a risk assessment framework for assessing sea lice interactions with wild salmonids. We have removed specific grounds for which licences may be granted to take seals by fish farmers. We are bringing forward mandatory controls relating to wild wrasse harvesting for use as cleaner fish in the salmon farming sector. SEPA continued to develop its revised finfish sector plan, particularly with regards to organic waste discharges. To close, sustainability must and will continue to be at the heart of what we do to ensure that future generations can enjoy all the beauty and nature that Scotland has to offer while safeguarding jobs in local communities. I'm pleased that the Scottish salmon sector agrees, as is evident from their blueprint for sustainability, aligning, for example, with the Scottish Government's world-leading 2045 net zero targets. I hope members agree that there has been much progress since the committee's report, demonstrating the commitment to improvement and indeed moving beyond the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Now there are not surprisingly, a lot of questions which the committee would like to pose to you. The first questions are going to come from Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and good morning to your officials. The recently announced Blue Economy Action Plan, which the committee clearly welcomes, includes support for the sustainable growth of aquaculture. So could you outline to the committee Scottish Government's activities in this area to date and anything that's planned?
Yes, thank you. Well, in response to Mr MacDonald, I think as he knows more than most, Convener, Scotland's seas around our shores are an enormous asset to the country. We have very large seascape area, and we have a very large number of economic activities that enables, from oil and gas through to renewables, aquaculture, the traditional fishing sectors, of course, as well as in recreation, various occupations and pursuits, as well as tourism, recently cruise lining. So the blue economy is extremely important. In relation to aquaculture, our approach is developing the fish health framework, focusing on climate change, mortality and the use of medicines, the Salmon Interactions Working Group, the Regulators Technical Working Group, removal of licenses to lethally remove seals, research on acoustic deterrent devices to protect cetaceans, SEPA's Finfish Sector Plan, innovation through the SAIC, and also improving equalities through support for women in Scottish aquaculture. So there's a whole range of activity, Convener, in response to Angus MacDonald's question that we are taking forward to promote sustainable aquaculture as part of our blue economy.
Thank you. Angus.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. That certainly sounds like an extensive plan, so we look forward to these developing. Moving on, you'll be aware that the Eclair Committee, which I also serve on, considered that an independent assessment of the environmental sustainability of the predicted growth of the sector is necessary. Can you advise the committee if such an assessment has been carried out? And if not, when will such an assessment be undertaken?
Thank you, Convener. Certainly the aquaculture industry leadership targets are sector-derived targets. They're not owned by the Scottish Government, but we do support the sector's ambition for growth, growing sustainably. And our task, and we're working hard to perform all components of this task, is through the working groups and other initiatives to make sure that growth is sustainable through the fish health framework, through action on sea lice, on interactions, on RAS, on removal of the licenses to lethally remove seals, doing further research on acoustic deterrent devices to protect cetaceans. And we also see, of course, Convener, that the sector itself has invested enormously over the past years in improving sustainability, for example, through hatcheries and through the ability in hatcheries to grow salmon beyond the juvenile period so that the fish spend less time at sea. And that in itself, I think, is a greater element of sustainability, which is sometimes overlooked. I'm really heartened that the SSPO, under the leadership of Tavi Scott, a former distinguished MSP and Cabinet Secretary, is working closely with the Scottish Government in pursuit of sustainability as well as growth. And I think it's correct that we pay we pay due regard to both aspects as we go forward.
Angus,
Yeah, thank you, convener.
is that you complete?
Yes,
Oh,
happy with the responses.
Okay, thanks very much, Angus. The next questions were actually questions that Richard Lyle wanted to ask. Unfortunately, he is having problems with his internet connection, so I may pose them for him, yeah, and I apologise in advance if I am not following the thread that he wanted. Cabinet Secretary, can you explain, please, what you believe applying the precautionary principle is in relation to agriculture?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it means that as we seek to work with the sector to pursue growth, we make sure that we do so in a sustainable way, having regard to the marine environment and other marine users. I've already alluded to the approach that we are taking, and I believe that this is in pursuit of the principle to which the convener refers. For example, in tightening the regulation on sea lice, for example, on introducing mandatory rules in respect of the use of RAS, for example, in encouraging the use of hatcheries, for example, in terminating the use of licenses in respect of seals, and for example, in pursuit of a spatial framework approach, and also taking forward the recommendations of the interactions group, the recommendations of the group chaired by John Goodlad, himself a distinguished figure in the marine sector in Scotland, as members well know. So, my officials, convener, can go into the detail of all of these things, but the precautionary principle means applying the correct approach to make sure that growth is not at the expense of other users of the marine environment, but that it does enable the companies to expand and generally move, I think, as we've seen in Norway. I'll finish with this, convener, because I'm sure many other opportunities, but in Norway, which I had the pleasure of visiting last autumn, the move is away from having a very large number of small pens to a lesser number of large pens. And that move, I think, is seen as consistent with sustainability and the precautionary principle, although it brings its own challenges in terms of engineering and protection against escapes and so on. But our approach is determined by the need to be careful, to pursue caution in how we proceed. And I think it's in line with generally speaking, with the ask that Parliament made of the Scottish Government following the inquiries that took place a couple of years ago now.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. My understanding of the precautionary principle is you don't do something unless you know that there will be no adverse effects as a result of it. So that's my understanding. I think there is a court case that defines what the precautionary principle is. I'm going to have a look at it afterwards. But as this is Richard's question, I will leave that one there. And his second question was how you're interpreting that precautionary principle, or the Scottish Government is, in relation to producing planning guidance in relation to fish farms, development and expansion. And has anything changed in practice in relation to the committee's recommendation to apply the precautionary principle since the report was published in 2018? Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the principle is a cornerstone of the marine plan and the planning policy. So policy has been implemented to enable this to be applied to new developments in a meaningful and effective way, including, incidentally, the presumption against further marine finfish farm development on the north and east coasts to safeguard migratory fish species. So that's one very clear example. New developments are required to undergo planning pre-consultation, consultation with statutory parties and an EMP for managing ongoing behaviour, whilst also requiring a CAR consent for discharge following extensive modelling to appropriately manage water quality and benthic impact, and a marine licence, including FHI, ensuring fish health improvement, ensuring disease management is acceptable. So, I'm just going through a whole series of processes, Convener, that I think together cumulatively implement, if you like, the principle in practice.
Cabinet Secretary, my question, understand the principles, most of which have been in place prior to the report. Some of them have been expanded. Is my specific question, has the Scottish Government produced any planning guidance on how the precautionary principle should be applied in relation to fish farm development? Now, that's a yes or no question. What's the answer, Cabinet Secretary?
Well, I'm not. Well, hang on a second. I mean, I'm not here as the planning minister, and I'm not. With great respect, I'm just not sure that these planning matters are susceptible of simple, straightforward answers in the way that. But I mean, in case I'm missing something, Convener, I thought I had answered your question. To be honest with you, giving lots of examples, you disagree. I'm happy if my officials want to come in and give any further information of a factual nature which they think is relevant.
Take any of the officials that you'd like to bring in to confirm what planning guidance. I'd be surprised if you didn't know what planning guidance had been issued in a sector which you're responsible for. Happy to take any official that you'd like to bring in, Cabinet Secretary. Which one would you like to bring in?
Well, I have run through a number of the approaches that the planning requires to be taken, all of which have a specific purpose. And we'll probably come on to the spatial framework, which is other piece of work which is fairly well advanced. But I think if Mr. Mitchell wants to come in to address the question you asked, Convener, in case there's anything that I've overlooked.
Perfect. Mr. Mitchell, planning guidance, new planning guidance.
Thank you, Convener. I think I would echo what the Cabinet Secretary has said in terms of the precautionary principle, in terms that we reflect the requirements of the EU in that sense, and those are primarily reflected in our National Marine Plan, but also in our planning guidance, which exists and advises local authorities. In terms of any change on precautionary principle in the 2 years, which I think may be at the heart of your question, we do now expect to see environment management plans going forward, in addition to the whole array of considerations which take place at the time of planning, to ensure that the ongoing sustainability of the farm is acceptable. And I think, again, as Cabinet Secretary has just alluded to, beyond those EMPs, it is very much the case that we are looking to put in place further guidance through a spatial framework, which will allow clearer, more certain advice to be given to planning authorities in the first instance in terms of the location of new farms. And it's probably worth just reconfirming that the approach we take beyond things like the National Marine Plan is very much focused on the individual planning application that's being received and the sustainability of that and the application of a precautionary principle in that regard.
Okay, I think we've moved away from planning guidance, but on the basis that the next questions will be from Mike Rumbles, I think, Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I want to pursue the issue of planning, actually, because our report of 2 years ago recommended that guidance should be produced, specifying those areas across Scotland that are suitable or unsuitable for the siting of salmon farms. And this was to take a strategic view of planning applications rather than an individual and piecemeal approach. I notice Mr. Mitchell just mentioned that they're only taking an individual planning application view here so far. So our witnesses confirmed to us 2 weeks ago that not much seems to have been done, and I would suggest not very much at all. So why are we being given the impression that this major recommendation of the committee is simply gathering dust on the shelf?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I thank Mr. Rumbles for his question, and you probably won't be astonished to hear that I don't quite see things the same way. We have been extremely diligent in pursuing all these series of issues that we need in order to pursue and deliver sustainable aquaculture. And I think there's a certain element of the horse being put before the cart here, because in a sense, Mr. Rumbles, I hope you'll agree with this, because I absolutely sincerely mean this. We have to tackle issues such as sea lice, wrasse, interactions with wild salmon. They're all very controversial topics, particularly the interaction with other species. And if you like, we had to do that work first before we could then put in place the proper planning framework. You see what I'm driving at here? There's a whole jigsaw here, and we have to get the right bits in the right order. And if you like, the planning process can only be finalised once the substance of the arguments regarding interactions, for example, are properly considered. In the interim, though, as Mr. Mitchell has described, the Marine Scotland does expect an environmental management plan to be delivered, and that is a tightening up and improvement on the previous system. The next step, and we've done an awful lot of work on this in relation to modelling and the various factors at play with regard to flushing of in the marine environment, for example. But the next step will help us deliver that improved planning framework, and that is the adaptive spatial framework, a strategic approach, which I think Mr. Rumbles is suggesting we should have, and I agree with him, for assessing the potential risk of the transfer of sea lice from farm fish to wild salmon. And this spatial framework is fairly close to being completed. And it's important we get these things right, in the sense of getting as much buy-in as we can from industry, as well as from the environmental groups who take a close interest in all of these matters, and the regulators. So it's a complex business, Mr. Rumbles, it really is, but we have been extremely diligent in working hard on all the pieces of the jigsaw. The planning response, if you like, can only really be finalised once these other matters are dealt with. In other words, if we had just put some planning framework in and had done nothing about sea lice, done nothing about wrasse, done nothing about interactions, you would be saying, well, hang on a second, surely you should have dealt with the substance first to make sure that we have proper environmental protection. So, I'm genuinely trying to give a direct answer to Mr. Rumble's question, perfectly fair question, but trying to put it in perspective. And because we need to proceed on the basis of evidence, and because evidence is often either in scarce supply or a matter of interpretation, that does mean that we have to proceed, I think, convener, with care, and that is what we're doing. But I'm confident that the spatial framework should be available fairly shortly to help inform us in finalising the planning approach. And indeed, finally, the fourth planning framework will reflect the Scottish Government's aim of supporting sustainable growth, and it will help guide new developments to locations that will best suit industry needs, but also with due regard to the marine environment. So that fourth national planning framework will take that forward in a way I hope that members will support.
Yeah, Convener, yes, I've heard everything the Minister has said, and I agree with him. He's absolutely right, and I'm heartened by what he has said about the strategic. But I have to say, looking at the evidence that we've been given from 2 weeks ago, and now from Mr. Mitchell, the Deputy Director of Aquaculture, and I wrote these words down when he was speaking just before the Minister. He said, our approach is very much on the individual planning application. Now, I hope I'm not taking that out of context, and I hope it does dovetail with Mr. Ewing's support for a strategic approach to this, and that we might see this in the fourth national planning framework. But I have to say, I would gently say to the Cabinet Secretary that yes, all of these issues about sea lice and all these other things and the pollution, absolutely essential And it's absolutely right that and the government is on top of that. It doesn't mean, though, that work cannot be done at the same time, working towards the production of a strategic view. And I see that Mr. Ewing is nodding, and I hope he can confirm that that is the approach that we should really be taking.
Yes, I'm happy to confirm broadly that that is the approach that we are pursuing. And I think Mr. Rumbles is entirely correct to say that we should be working on the planning issues. We are doing that in tandem with other matters, but we can't quite finalise it yet. But I don't think we're actually that far away, convener. COVID has delayed a lot of things, frankly, as we know. It's caused a lot of practical issues for everybody involved in aquaculture, and has brought with it its challenges. But nonetheless, we are quite close, I think, to finalising particular work in the spatial framework and then the national planning framework. But the work has been going on, and I can assure you that actually John McNerney, the chief planner, has taken a personal interest by attending the industry leadership group and taking a close personal interest in this matter himself. And I just say that to reassure members that, that this has been the subject of a lot of collaborative working with our planning colleagues.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. The next questions are from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, the general public expects that this industry should exist without damaging the marine environment. And rightly so, I would argue. And as evidence of the effectiveness or otherwise of the new regulatory framework becomes available, what action will the Scottish Government take if it is shown that more work is needed?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I agree that the industry must conduct itself to avoid having adverse impacts on the environment, and that's really what it's working towards. And therefore, we are proceeding on the basis of that factor, that objective, very much being in mind. And it's an iterative process. I mean, it's I don't think the process ever entirely stops, not least because technology is changing all the time. For example, convener, there is being piloted in Norway at the moment a method of, if you like, collecting the discharge, the waste from salmon, collecting it from the marine environment to prevent it from falling onto the seabed. In fact, it's a Scottish company that I believe is in the vanguard of that research. There is also a desire to trial similar methods of preventing the discharges from getting into the marine environment permanently, being proposed in Scotland. Now, I just mentioned that as two modern technological innovations, which are extremely encouraging for the future of aquaculture. And because technology is improving apace, because we're seeing in Norway, as the world leaders really, the trend of moving from many, many small pens close to shore or sea lofts further out is in itself, I think, more sustainable from an environmental point of view. It does bring challenges in terms of safety in operating further out at sea, as Mr. Chapman will appreciate. But what I'm saying is that the industry is changing all the time, and regulation has got to adapt and change with it. I'm happy that we are in Scotland proceeding apace with improvements, as I've mentioned twice earlier. And that work will need to continue, I think, to answer Mr. Chapman's question directly.
Yeah, well, thank the Cabinet Secretary for that, and I appreciate that things move on, and we need to be able to adapt. But one of the committee's recommendations was that wild fish interactions needed to be the responsibility of one agency. And we heard that there was a proliferation of various agencies that were involved in that piece of work. But we've heard that no change no change has taken place in roles regarding the interaction with wild fish. So have you considered any changes to the statutory roles and responsibilities of the various organisations that that monitor this industry?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we are. Sorry, Convener. We are working hard to consider a response to the, I think, 40 recommendations. excuse me, 40 recommendations of the working group, the interactions working group, and these cover a whole range of areas. And my officials can speak, I think, with more authority about the detail of these. But I think of its nature, the relationship and the interactions between the farm sector and the wild sector cross-cut across different organisations. That is something that's unavoidable. Myself, Rosanna Cunningham, local authorities, SEPA, Marine Scotland. I think maybe the wider question, Convener, is, should there be a kind of a streamlining of the whole regulatory approach? Is it a little bit too complicated? Certainly, many people argue that that's the case. And therefore, I think the answer to Mr. Chapman's question is it would be desirable to have one body in charge, but I think we should really look at the whole sector. If we're going to further reform the regulatory system, I don't think we should do it on a sort of piecemeal approach, picking one particular aspect, important though it is. We should look at the whole. And in that respect, the Norwegian model, I think, has got a lot to learn from. And indeed, one of the features of it there is that they have an agency that deals with promoting fish health itself. And I'm very pleased to say, Convener, that one of the developments is that the Chief Veterinary Officer from Scotland, Sheila Vos, has agreed to chair the Fish Health Framework now and bring her expertise of fish health to the fore. I think that's a very positive development for these very issues.
Peter.
Yeah, I think that there was a general feeling from the committee that there was a confusion of regulation and regulators, and we needed a simplification of that. And my final question is: the Scottish Government considering a regulatory regime for wild fish interactions? That specific piece of wild fish interactions, is there a consideration of some kind of regulation for that specific issue?
Well, I can maybe pass to my officials specifically, but can I just say that my understanding is that this expert group that John Goodland chaired identified 12 factors that may have an influence on, if you like, the decline of wild fish, salmon and trout, particularly salmon. And they range through climate change to predation, predation by seals, to interactions with aquaculture. So, if you like, that issue itself is not solely an issue. The issue of wild salmon and wild trout and the impacts that have caused a diminution in numbers over several decades. There's a very complex issue where there's not just one factor. It's not solely farm salmon that is at stake here or at issue. There's a whole plethora of factors covering, a very wide range of threats to the mortality of wild salmon in various factors. So I don't think that singling out one of those 12 would, if you like, necessarily help address the problem. But I don't know if any of the 40 recommendations specifically covered this. So to enable that point to be closed down, Convener, I wonder if Mr. Palmer or Mr. Mitchell might care to, if there's anything else that either of them can add.
Very briefly, Cabinet Secretary, I'm sure we can bring one of them in. Who would like to come in? Neither of them are saying they want to come in. Oh, Alistair does. Sorry.
Thank you. My apologies. In terms of simplification within the existing regime, I think we are doing some positive things. We've introduced a wellboats order, which is essentially taken Marine Scotland licensing out of wellboat consideration for their discharges, and that now all rests with SEPA. And we are looking actively at other opportunities. As Mr. Ewing alluded to, one of the things the Norwegians do is that they coordinate through a single consenting regime all of the regulators' views, so that for the developer or the fish farmer, there is kind of a one-stop shop approach. And I think we're actively looking at what we might do in that space here in Scotland. As far as the Salmon Interactions Working Group and a single regulatory body, I think we would recognise that as far as the interactions question is concerned, there may be opportunity to look at a single regulator in that space. But as Mr. Ewing again alludes to, we need to get the evidential base and the full range of considerations as part of the evidence to look at who might be right for that role and how that would work. And I think before all of that, actually getting in place a spatial planning framework which does look beyond the current regime and looks at water body capacity perhaps, which is the kind of direction of travel that we've been talking about. That is a kind of necessary prerequisite, I think, of understanding how this will work and who the right body might be. But currently, I think it's fair to reflect that remains the planning authority through the environment management plan that they put in place when planning permission is given.
Thank you very much, Alistair. The next questions then come from Emma Harper. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Am I on? Yeah, okay. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. One of my questions is related to public bodies which have a duty under the Nature Conservation Scotland Act to further the conservation of biodiversity. So I'm interested to know whether any review has been carried out or is in process on the exercise of public bodies' statutory duty to further conservation of biodiversity with respect to salmon farming.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, there is a statutory duty, I think, on all public bodies, including the Scottish Government, to further the conservation of biodiversity when carrying out the responsibilities. And we have been doing that. For example, the designation of the West of Scotland MPA represents Europe's largest marine protected area and will safeguard vulnerable marine life under threat in deeper waters across the Northeast Atlantic. It covers an area of 100,000 square kilometres. We are carrying out a 3-yearly review of conservation of biodiversity in the marine environment, and so that is in process. And reports under the period, I'm told, the 218 to 220, are due to be published in January next year. So I just mentioned some elements here. I've got a lot more factual information in my briefing material here, but a lot of work has been done here to conserve biodiversity in the marine environment.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. You mentioned also the Salmon Interactions Working Group earlier and interactions with wild farmed fish. Do you have any thoughts on licensing conditions in relation to wild farm fish interactions?
What sort of licenses, or what sort of are you envisaging a particular kind of?
Not really. The Salmon Interactions Working Group identified a number of recommendations, and overall they were recommending a number of robust conditions that should be attached to licences for salmon farms. So the salmon farming and the report was all new to me as a recent addition, well, maybe not a recent addition to this committee now, but in our briefing papers, one of our questions talks about licensing conditions. So I suppose that would be attached to particular farms or sizes or position where they would be in relation to being close to land or further out to sea, I suppose.
Cabinet Secretary, I think you understand the question. I think it's to do with the conditions as well that are placed on applications, as well as the licences granted by SEPA and the Crown Office in relation to seabed. But maybe, Cabinet Secretary, you know more than me and you can explain it all to us.
Well, I'm tempted to explain bits of it, but I think it might be better just to ask officials, given it's largely a technical matter here, if that's in order. I mean, plainly, much of what I've mentioned already about tightening up sea lice regulations are designed to improve the interaction issue, and the spatial framework will take this forward, and the EMP requirement earlier will also have regard to all these issues. But I wonder if Mr. Mitchell or Mr. Palmer might want just to provide a more technical answer about the licensing issue. Convener, if that's in order.
Yeah, I'm just looking to see who's wanting to come in. Alistair's ready to come in. Alistair, if I could ask you to do that briefly, and if we don't get all the answers, I'm sure Emma will be happy to get a written response afterwards. She is nodding.
Okay, that's fine. I'll be brief. The Environment Management Plan currently is the mechanism. We may look to change that over time, but that's currently where any requirement as far as the interaction with wild fish is concerned and sea lice. In addition, Fish Health Inspectorate expect to see appropriate measures in place on the farm, and Mr. Ewing alluded to reporting levels and intervention levels where sea lice are thought to be becoming an issue or becoming an infestation which may risk the farm fish and the broader population of wild fish beyond the farm gate. So I think those are the kind of primary areas for now that are used to ensure control.
Thank you, Alistair. Emma, have you further questions on that subject?
Final question?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. It's about work that's ongoing in relation to technical standards for fin fish aquaculture. Witnesses provided us information basically saying that the infrastructure on the farms and the equipment would have to be how we rely on preventing escapes in the future. So what work is ongoing in relation to these technical standards?
Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, well, there's two there's two issues here. First of all, with regard to escapes, a huge amount of work has gone on across a whole range of areas, including the type of nets used, which can avoid a kind of nudging by seals, which is a big factor behind escapes. So the manufacture of the nets in a certain way is designed to deal with this. The design of pens themselves to provide, in the larger ones, a safe area for fish to retreat when seals are approaching. There's a whole kind of corpus of practical things that the industry is doing to tackle escapes, and I'm no expert in this, but obviously I discuss this and listen to discussions on the industry leadership group about this. But in relation to the technical standards, I'm advised that we are updating the Scottish Finfish technical standards, which were published, I think, about 5 years ago, including consideration of climate change and higher energy sites in order to improve containment at fish farm sites. And the work on this has been delayed because of COVID, but we hope to complete this work early next year. So, that work has been ongoing and should be coming to a conclusion fairly shortly.
Thank you, and thank you, Emma. Colin, I think yours are the next questions. Colin Smith.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. It was suggested to the committee when we took evidence last week that the work in the Farm Fish Health Working Group hadn't achieved a great deal. It had pretty much stalled. So it would be good to get your thoughts on that, Cabinet Secretary, and in particular why it was decided to reformat the working group.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. Well, the Fish Health Framework, I think, has made significant progress in its first year, as indeed we reported to Parliament back in July 2019. And as a new work stream, it was sensible to review the working practices, which we did, in order to inform how best to move forward. So the steering group itself, to answer Mr. Smith's question, made recommendations for streamlining its governance to focus on the areas which they considered could make the most difference to fish health in Scotland. And the new approach does that, rather than having multiple work streams operating under different leadership. The introduction of a single steering group and chairperson, I think, allows us to focus this work more clearly. I've mentioned that Sheila Voss, Distinguished Chief Veterinary Officer, is now leading that work. I think the last thing I would say, so I think stalled is not fair, really. It's not fair to those people that worked extremely hard in this area, in a very complex area, incidentally. But it is intended that the Fish Health Framework is not a one-off ad hoc response. It's a standing response over a 10-year period where we're working closely with industry, with environmental scientists, with others, in order to improve the issue of fish health generally. And therefore, it's not something that has a short life working group approach. It's going to be part of our approach for the several years ahead, to focus even more on fish health, as I alluded to in the answer to an earlier question.
It was given to committee in July 2019. So can I ask what has been achieved since that update, and what are the priorities for the next few months?
Well, certainly, sorry, Convener, I think that there was a cut-off of the first part of Mr. Smith's question, but I think he's asking the priorities for fish health. So the priorities are several. I mean, sea lice, since the last reporting to Parliament, legislation to introduce mandatory reporting of average sea lice numbers has been progressed and will be laid in Parliament later this month. So that's a really important area where we have made progress, I would suggest. Analysis mortality by cause, so we remain committed to this work and have recently reinvigorated discussion with the SSPO, who are taking it forward as a partner of the framework. On climate change and ocean acidification, we recognise that there are implications of climate change and acidification for the health of fish. The previous climate change subgroup considered how best to create real-time monitoring of plankton and provision of alerts to the presence of potentially harmful phytoplankton species. As a result of that, collaboration between Marine Scotland and institutions such as SAMS, a studentship has been advertised to develop new techniques in phytoplankton monitoring. On treatments and medicines, again, a very important practical area. The framework is about collaborative working and to provide a scientific practitioners forum for discussion, and the transfer of wellboat licensing, which Mr. Mitchell referred to SEPA, and the introduction of its sectoral aquaculture plans addresses issues relating to use of medicines. I could go on, but these are some of the important issues, Convener, that lots of work has been done, and therefore, I'm grateful to Mr. Smith for giving me the opportunity to demonstrate that, the vehicle has not stalled. The vehicle is moving forward at moderate speed and is doing a lot of work on the practical issues that we all need to grapple with, and which I hope members will agree are all extremely important and serious.
Thank you. Colin, is that you complete? Okay, well, we move on to the next questions that come from John Finney. John.
Secretary and your officials. Cabinet Secretary, you've touched on this, I think, 3 or 4 times now. Indeed, you've referred to it as a controversial topic, and that is sea lice. Could you please update the committee on the review of the evidence of reporting and intervention thresholds for sea lice? Now, I know you've alluded to legislation that's coming. Can you provide also some details of the Scottish Government's statutory instrument and what precisely it will introduce, please?
Okay. Well, I think I have kind of given a kind of a ministerial overview of this, that we are moving to kind of tighten up the regulations. And I wonder if maybe I could just pass to officials to give an answer to the question, which I think is a technical aspect about the content of the statutory instrument, which something which I think officials might be better placed to comment on, as they've been more directly dealing with this work than myself, convener. My job is to overview and to make sure that we move forward with the measures, but the detail of the measures, I wonder if Mr. Mitchell could enlighten the committee.
Before we go to Alistair, I think John wants a sort of supplementary to be put in there as well. John, sorry.
Thank you, convener. Yeah, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. If Mr. Mitchell could touch on the extent to which the review of evidence of the reporting and the interventions informed the direction that's going to be taken.
Thank you. Yeah. So the Farm Fish Health Framework was kind of the overarching body which looked at this. There was a recognition, I think, from the committee, which we seized as important from your report, which was that at the time, sea lice reporting was voluntary by the sector and was done on I think at that time possibly a 3-monthly basis. Perhaps it had moved to 1 monthly at that point, and that was thought to be inadequate. So our regulation, which, as Mr. Ewing has alluded to, should come to Parliament before the end of December, puts on a statutory footing the requirement to make for each farm, or each farm indeed, to report on a weekly basis in arrears on the numbers of female lice found on the farmed fish therein, from a sample which is agreed as good practice. That regulation will come into force in March 2021, at which point, in addition to our Fish Health Inspectorate being aware of all of the numbers, there will be a public face to that, so that people can interrogate at a farm level what's happening in terms of sea lice performance, as I say, weekly, 1 week in arrears. So you're looking at a kind of fortnight time lag approximately, which is a significant change and improvement on previously. And that will start on the Marine Scotland website, but we'll move on to Scotland's aquaculture website in due course once we've got the IT fixed. I hope that answers the question. John.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Mitchell. Yes, a further question, if I may, convener, for the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, there's a lot of interest about the relationship the Scottish Government has with the industry. Now, the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation suggested that reporting and intervention thresholds for sea lice were voluntarily reduced, whilst the Scottish Government stated in a letter to the committee in July of 2019 that the changed threshold was a result of review of farmed fished sea lice policy. Which is it, please? And can you explain how the process for reviewing the sea lice threshold works and how conclusions have been reached, please?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I don't really see that there is a contradiction here, because The reality is that, quite rightly, I think, the Scottish Government does work very closely with the SSPO, which is an extremely responsible, a representative body comprising within it many people of considerable expertise in the marine science area and in general matters relating to aquaculture. So I don't think there's a contradiction in terms of the SSPO voluntarily reducing thresholds and how the reduction on reporting and intervention limits were lowered or implemented by the Scottish Government. I mean, obviously, these were matters that were discussed and considered very carefully. And there's broadly a kind of a shared sense that we needed to tighten things up. And that's what we've done. We weren't kind of foisting a regime on industry without consulting them. We were discussing with them how together we can work to tighten things up, to meet some of the concerns that were expressed to this committee in the course of its inquiry. And the industry has been supportive, largely, of changes in sea lice policy. So while the lowering of thresholds became government policy and implemented, the SSPO did contribute to the position being reached, and they've accepted that voluntarily. So I don't really see that there's a contradiction here, Convener. Quite the opposite. I think things work best when government's working closely with regulators, with industry, with environmental bodies, and that's really what Marine Scotland in particular seeks to do. I mean, if Mr. Finney wanted to pursue this, I'm sure Mr. Palmer could probably give more information about the details of this. But I hope I've tried to answer his question fairly directly.
I'm content with that. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, Richard Lyle, you have had to change location, I think, to sort your broadband. Welcome back. You have now some questions, I believe, that you'd like to ask. Richard.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, unfortunately, my Wi-Fi went down in my constituency office and I have come home. Cabinet Secretary, good morning. Knowing you, I'm sure the vehicle is moving forward correctly and things are being done since we last looked at this. Can I ask you, has the Scottish Government developed a consistent reporting methodology for collection of information on the causes of farmed fish mortality? And if so, when does the Scottish Government expect that this will be published, and how will it ensure that the methodology is applied?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, obviously, we take the issue of mortality very seriously, as indeed I've alluded to previous answers that I've given. And we do think that, this is an industry responsibility. Industry is best placed to undertake the work, and the SSPO is committed to doing so. We are assured by them that this work is underway to create a standardised approach to the recording of on-farm mortality that will allow an annual analysis of the causes of salmon mortalities across companies to be produced. So this information will be a main source of evidence to inform further work by the Fish Health Framework to take forward, including its implementation, and it will provide an analysis which is measurable and comparable over time. And we understand that the SSPO plans to complete this analysis in the early part of next year.
Richard.
As I say, I know things are being done, but does the Scottish Government have any plans to improve the presentation and accessibility of fish farm data, which many people would like to see?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Yes, we've already committed, as I think I've mentioned earlier, to the publication of average sea lice numbers, which will be reported to us on a statutory basis within 1 week of receiving the information. And we understand that the information, the importance of providing accessibly such data, and have committed to publication of data on SEPA's aquaculture website. However, this does require some additional IT development to both the systems deployed by Marine Scotland and SEPA, and work is underway on both systems, but it won't be completed in the immediate future. If need be, therefore, the sea lice data will be published on Marine Scotland's website in the interim.
Thank you, Convener, and yet again my apologies for my system going down. Thank you, Convener.
Remarkable versatility, if I might say so. Cabinet Secretary, just before we leave that, can I just ask the question, if you look at mortality figures on the website, you get a percentage of production. It's not till if you interrogate SEPA that you actually get tons of loss. Which do you think is a more accurate way of reflecting mortality in fish farms?
Well, I'm not a statistician. I'm a cabinet secretary, so I'm not about to profess expertise in areas where I don't possess that expertise. I can go away and come back. I think I should probably go away and come back with a letter to the committee after officials have had a chance to look at this, Convener, unless they want to answer now.
I'm very happy. I'm very happy, given the constraints of time, and for a response to the letter format, Cabinet Secretary. The next questions come from the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and your team. Cabinet Secretary, you'll be aware of research undertaken or on behalf of Sustainable Inshore Fisheries Trust and the Salmon and Trout Conservation Scotland body, which suggests that the economic and employment benefits of salmon farming are overstated, and the Scottish Government analyses do not adequately consider the costs to other marine users. I mean, as a Cabinet Secretary who's out and about a lot normally, and indeed you have a constituency in the Highlands yourself, do you come across lots of adverse comments and adverse comments about the fish farming industry in the Highland communities?
Well, I do get emails from some people who have criticisms of the industry, and that's fair enough. But I can say, as a constituency MSP in Inverness, that one of the largest private sector employers in Inverness, one of the very largest employers is Gale Force Marine, that is a major company in the supply chain. In fact, the UK's largest chandlery, but also manufactures, as I understand it, feed barges for the sector, and also pens. They purchased a company called Fusion, and they now manufacture pens. So, I mean, I know several people that work for that company, and a very successful company is operating in many countries. Equally, in places like Lark Hall, there's centres of excellence in the salmon sector. So, onshore, there's lots of jobs, but this is really an industry of the periphery, on the edge, where there are opportunities for people to earn, an average of £37,000, and that's probably about twice the average earnings from other opportunities, even if other opportunities exist. I mean, I used to represent Lochaber, and places like Lochallan and Marine Harvest at that time are big employer, a big supporter, incidentally, of local communities, such as through their sponsorship of the Camanach over many years. And I do see the aquaculture sector as providing enormous opportunities for Scotland, especially on the west coast and our islands, in the more remote locations, but also in scientific research, in engineering. It's a kind of engineering industry increasingly as we move to larger pens. And in addition to that, of course, the salmon itself as a source of protein has, I think, about the lowest carbon footprint of any foodstuff. And thereby, arguably, it has a big contribution to make to tackling climate change in producing protein in a way that is congenial to our climate change objectives. So our own the wider economic impacts of aquaculture study reported, I think, that the wider supply chain is worth £880 million a year and supports 11,700 jobs across the Scottish economy That's a fairly substantial number, and I see this as very positive. But we're working with industry. We're working very hard to tackle, as we've discussed this morning already, convener, some of the issues which people are concerned about, and fairly concerned about, so that we're actually tackling these problems and making progress with them alongside other countries who are doing similar things.
Thank you for that. I mean, the report suggests that the GVA, which has been extensively quoted and relied on by High and Marine Scotland, is possibly exaggerated by 124%, whilst employment could be overestimated by a massive 251%. So I suppose what I want to ask is whether the Scottish Government is considering carrying out its own independent cost-benefit analysis for current fish farming and its expansion to understand whether there really is a net benefit to Scotland and satisfy itself that such an expansion would on balance be beneficial rather than detrimental.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, it's not standard practice to assess an entire sector on the framework of a cost-benefit analysis, but I think what I would say is a sort of practical answer to the question is this, that, Maureen Watt is correct. I do ordinarily get out and about, and, I visited I opened, in fact, the new hatchery in Invergarry. I visited the premises in Oban. I am aware of the investment in Kylaken. I've mentioned Gilforce Marine, but there are many other companies that are operating that are not really household names at all. I've seen the investment. In fact, I would say actually that I cannot think of a sector, certainly in the rural economy, where there has been more investment than in aquaculture. And that investment has been designed not only to increase the productivity and profitability, but also the sustainability in hatcheries, as I've said before. I actually think that there are tremendous opportunities ahead in aquaculture sector in Scotland, provided we work hard at ensuring sustainability. That there are enormous opportunities to grow the supply chain in Scotland. And many people say, well, the industry is mostly owned by the Norwegians. I mean, I've met and spoken to, on many occasions, representatives from Norway of leading companies, and they are absolutely committed to investing in Scotland and investing in the Scottish supply chain as well. And that dialogue, that work with them, I think means that aquaculture actually is one of the most exciting sectors that we have in Scotland, using our natural assets, providing very well-paid jobs, and also with the prospect of real increase in engineering solutions and the application of marine science to, if you like, further clean up the discharges, as I gave in the example earlier. So I think that the sensible approach for the Scottish Government is to continue to do what we're doing for sustainability, but also up our game in terms of seeing opportunities for sustainable expansion and build on the enormous investment that there has been, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds in Scotland's rural economy invested over the last few years.
Thank you for that. I mean, have you come across communities or businesses, for example, like tourism businesses on the West Coast, smaller inshore fishers who have been adversely affected by salmon farming? And is there any action that is required by the Scottish Government to assist these businesses?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I can't think directly of any individual example where a company has said that their business has suffered direct financial significant losses as a result of salmon farming. I mean, obviously, I mentioned right at the beginning that in the blue economy, we've got the inshore sector, the shellfish sector. We've got the wild salmon sector, and we need to find a way, which I think largely we do, of accommodating all of these interests. But I think what I've found in my work in the Highlands, and that's really where most of the activity is that the people that work in the industry are, friends of, part of the community, alongside people that are going out with the creels, or indeed crofters, or indeed tenant farmers. They're all part of the fabric of rural Scottish society, and I think that the advent of aquaculture has prevented a slow death of many rural communities in the west coast of Scotland. Had it not existed, what would have taken its place? And there's another thing, this is very personal, but when the Nancy Glen was lifted, it was actually people working on a feed barge that rang for the rescue. If they hadn't been there, would the young chap who survived have got out, been rescued? That's just a very personal thing to me, because I was very much involved with that. But I think it illustrates, that these guys are part of the community along with everybody else. And I hope that people can focus and accentuate the positive in future as we go forward, whilst trying to eliminate the negative.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to park that comment there, Deputy Convener. We're going to go on to the next questions, which are from John Finney. John.
Thank you, Convener. But before I move to the Greek questions, I would like to follow up something that the Deputy Convener raised with the Cabinet Secretary in relation to the information that the committee were sent by the Sustainable Inshore Fisheries Trust. I can ask you about this, Cabinet Secretary. It is about the absence of an independent cost-benefits analysis and the assertion made by the Sustainable Inshore Fishery Trust, and I quote here, "We understand the absence of a relevant CBA, cost-benefits analysis, breaches Scottish Government guidelines on providing financial and other support for a particular industry as detailed in the Green Book and the Scottish Public Finance Manual." Can you comment on that, please?
Well, I'm not an expert in the Green Book, but I've already given, I think, quite a lot of fairly practical evidence about the demonstrable benefits that this industry provides. I have said, I think, that it's not standard practice to assess an entire sector in the framework of a cost-benefit analysis. This is typically undertaken in line with Green Book guidance when considering specific policy interventions. But we are engaged in a number of research projects and working groups to improve the sustainability of Scottish aquaculture, to mitigate potential environmental impacts and further support the blue economy developments. But I have absolutely no doubt at all, Convener, from 20 years as an MSP that's been in and about aquaculture and representing a Highland seat for that length of time, and indeed 10 years before that in campaigning in the Highlands. This is an integral part of our economy now. The value to Scotland is enormous, it's immense. I think that attempts to suggest this is not the case are confounded by the facts, and some of which I've mentioned. But no doubt there will be an ongoing debate by those that wish to pursue it. But meantime, we'll carry on working on further improving the sustainability and continuing to work very closely with the industry in order to make sure that Scotland gets the most out of this. That's really what I see my twin roles being, and I hope that members will agree that that's a kind of fair approach.
John.
But Cabinet Secretary, yeah, thank you. Cabinet Secretary, this is a very polarised debate. People ask, are you for or against it? Now, for the avoidance of doubt, I'm actually for salmon fish farmings. I want them to operate as good neighbours in an environmentally strong way. Our job as a committee is to scrutinise information that's put in front of us. So if you're not able to confirm that the funding is entirely aligned with the Green Blueprint Public Finance Manual just now, perhaps you could write to the committee on it and I'll move on to other questions. But I don't think it helps to polarise the debate and the scrutiny of this important industry in these terms. Okay. Well, I'll move.
Hold on, John. Sorry. I think the Cabinet Secretary, I couldn't quite hear you, Cabinet Secretary. Are you offering to write?
Well, I'm happy to write to the member because, you know, I haven't studied in this document that he refers, and I think to be fair to Mr. Finney, I should have a further look at that. So I will write to him on that. But with respect, I don't think I'm projecting things in a polarised way. But I'm very pleased to hear that Mr. Finney does support the sustainable growth of aquaculture. So maybe there's not so much between us as might be thought.
Cabinet Secretary, just to remind you that letter should come to the committee, not to Mr. Finney, because it was raised at the committee. Yeah. Sorry, John.
Well, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that. That would be helpful. Our job is to scrutinise, and I want to move on to the issue of regulation and enforcement, and perhaps the need for further change. Cabinet Secretary, we heard in relation to mortalities from Mr. Allen last week, and I quote here: "The legal process that the Fish Health Inspectorate could put in place with regard to mortality is limited." Now, given the understandable public concern about the levels of mortality, and that's before I mention salmon and trout conservation, talking about environmental management plans are not enforceable. The Salmons Interaction Working Group raising concerns about enforceability in relation to licensing conditions, sea lice and escapes. Do you think that regulators have adequate enforcement powers, or is this an area where you'd consider strengthening?
Well, Convener, we are improving the regulatory processes, including consideration of enforcement powers, based on the application of available evidence and continued enhancements in the scientific base. Certainly a recurring ask from industry representatives is for better regulation going forward to enable investment, with a willingness for developers to pay more if those conditions exist and developments can be brought on stream quicker and with more certainty, whilst maintaining appropriate environmental safeguards. So, we are taking that approach, and I think there has been much improvement since the committee's report in 2018, Convener. For example, through the Farm Fish Health Framework and the really positive steps in focusing on climate change, on mortalities, on the use of medicine, on RAS. I mean, I've gone through all this, I hope, to the satisfaction of the committee that, we haven't been sitting back with the car stalled. We have been really doing our best to tackle these serious and quite complex issues. Anything that happens in the marine environment is almost by definition more difficult for the data to be captured than on land, where it is visible and able to be sort of physically inspected and counted and analysed. I do think that regard should be had to that, but I think we all want to move forward in a way that eliminates the negatives. As I said, I was referring to factors, not people, actually. So, in just in case there's any misunderstanding, the negatives are, the problems the industry has had with escapes, mortalities, with disease, and with impacts, and we're taking this very, very seriously. So is the industry. If you look at its blueprint document published just very recently, I think that's the correct approach. So far as the precise detail of enforcement powers, I think I would probably have to bring in officials just to give the kind of letter of the law, or possibly, if Mr. Finney would prefer, write to the committee with a sort of more factual answer, because I do appreciate he's got a fair interest in this area, and it's a legitimate point. But I think we are making lots of progress on all of these issues.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you.
John, one further question. I assume you're going to accept the offer for a written response to the committee.
On your behalf and the committee's behalf, Convener, I think it would be very helpful to hear from the Cabinet Secretary on these, and particularly if he would touch on the issue raised by Mr. Allen, that the Fish Health Inspectorate regime is limited. That would be And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We're actually quite close to the time limit on this one, but thank you very much for all the questions and for the answers, Cabinet Secretary. As you will remember, there were 65 recommendations in the committee report, 54 of which required direct action by the Scottish Government. And given these two evidence sessions, it is probably appropriate the committee has a chance to reflect on how this has been achieved. But you have helped us in that process, so thank you. I am now going to have a 10-minute, a 9-minute break to allow the committee to prepare for the next session, which will start at 10:45, and I now suspend the meeting. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to those people who've been here already. This is agenda item 10, which is further to the session we had last week with the UK Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. The committee today is taking evidence on the implications of Brexit from the rural economy in Scotland. The committee will take evidence today from Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Tourism, who will be assisted by John Kerr, the Head of Agricultural Policy Division, and I believe Alan Gibb, the Acting Deputy Director, Sea Fisheries, Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary, can I ask you please to make a very brief opening statement? There are a lot of questions to get through, and I'm keen, as always, to get members' questions answered. Cabinet Secretary.
Convener, Brexit will have a significant impact on Scotland's rural economy and policy. The UK sheep sector is heavily dependent on exports to balance supply, with approximately 30% of production exported and the EU accounting for over 90% of that. So we know that the devastating effects that the no-deal 40 to 50% tariffs being applied are likely to have in the sector, resulting in a crash of perhaps 30% on the prices, jeopardising the future of many in the sector. And the sector is already financially fragile. So that's why I pushed very hard on the UK government to recommence work on the sheep compensation scheme. And I'm pleased that progress has been made in ensuring an appropriate scheme is in place for the end of the transition period. On agricultural funding, during the Brexit campaign, promises were made by pro-Brexit campaigners and government ministers in the UK that farmers and crofters would not be worse off, that EU funding would be matched post-Brexit. The UK government is not delivering on that promise. We now know that Scotland stands to lose out on £170 million of funding between now and 2024-25. This includes a failure to commit to delivering the 25.7 of annual convergence payments beyond 2022 that was the subject of the BEW review, a process supported by members of this committee. Indeed, in response to the BEW report in September last year, the UK government undertook to work with the devolved administrations to agree a fair funding allocation model for agricultural support. No such discussions took place, I'm afraid. On fisheries, UK ministers have conceded that there will be trade friction and possibly tariffs. The salmon industry could face costs of £9 million annually. The UK government must meet its commitment to prioritise seafood exports at the border to avoid spoilage. On fisheries funding, detail from the spending review are scarce. The allocation to Scotland would seem to be solely based on 2014 levels of funding, with no references to the increases in the EMFF allocation or even for inflation. In good faith, we entered into the process set out by DEFRA to engage with HMT on the level of need for these sectors. This long process, led by economic analysis, identified a funding requirement for Scotland of 62 million. This seems to have been totally ignored by HMT. Certainly, I've had no detailed reply on this from the UK. Finally, on labour, the end of the transition period will bring an end to free movement of people, and this could have a devastating impact, for example, on soft fruit, on vegetables, seasonal vegetable sector, who rely on seasonal workers. But I'm also concerned about the seafood processing industry, which is heavily dependent on EU labour, with 70% of the workforce in the Grampian region being from the EU. Convener, I'm happy to end there. I've sought to be brief. I'm happy to try and answer questions that you and your members will have. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I would remind all members, please, to keep their questions short and succinct and for the answers to be the same. That way I can get through all the questions from all the committee members, which is always my intention to do so. So the first question from Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Thanks, Convener. As the Cabinet Secretary knows, in January 2019, nearly 2 years ago now, Parliament unanimously agreed to request the Scottish Government to set up, which he did, the Future Farming and Food Policy Group, an opportunity to develop our own policy post-2024. This week, the UK Government came forward with its own view of the future for south of the border post-2024. Now, I know that the Cabinet Secretary's view is that Scotland's policy group is an independent group, which it is, and he can't interfere. But can he use all his good officers not to interfere? I'm not asking him to do that, but to encourage and, more importantly, to facilitate that group to report to him as soon as it's practical.
Convener, yes, we have been seeking to do that, and I very much hope that these efforts will bring fruit shortly. But I would say to Mr. Rumbles, and he was, if you like, the architect in one sense of this group, for which I'm grateful. But I would say that we haven't been waiting solely for this group to report. We have, as members know, in our programme for government, committed to taking forward farmer-led groups on devising new approaches for farming and the future of farming in Scotland. And members will also have been aware and I hope familiar with, in principle, the outcome of the report by Jim Walker, former NFUS president, on, if you like, suckler beef farming with improved practices to address climate change issues and seek reductions to methane emissions. I'm pleased to say that that work is now going forward, and I chaired along with Jim Walker, the first meeting of the programme board last Thursday, and the second meeting will be in a couple of weeks' time, and it's due to report actually in February. An arable group is being convened, as also the pig sector ILG is taking on this role, and I'm also working on establishing groups for dairy and hill farming. Now, the point about all this, and this is, I think, addressing, where Mr. Rumbles is coming from, is this. I have a very clear vision for the future of Scottish farming. I've enunciated it in recent times, and I will do so briefly now. It is that we combine high quality food production with pursuit of high environmental standards, and that we reward our farmers, crofters and land managers by continuing to provide them with a reliable and sufficient income, but with conditionality that income and continued income for what they do, producing food, must be combined with the conditionality of complying with high environmental standards, especially to meet our climate change targets, but also having regard to biodiversity. And that's my vision. Convener, I hope that it's shared by yourself and Mr. Rumbles and others. And I'm working now on groups with a farmer-led focus to secure practical solutions and also the buy-in of the various sectors of the farming community. And I'm very confident that this will be a substantial element of our way forward. Not everything, because we've got forestry and peatland and change in land use patterns to deal with as well. But I'm very confident now that I see a clear way forward for Scotland, if, of course, that's a vision that's shared by the electorate in just a few months' time.
Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement with the vision of how we need to proceed, but the Future Policy Group was meant to be, as I understand it, an overarching, bringing together all of the sectoral elements. And I appreciate the work that's been done on these sectoral elements, which the Cabinet Secretary has outlined. But it's really important, I believe, that, and I think Parliament would expect that this overarching view of the Future Policies Group does need to report fairly soon. And I do know that the Scottish Government has its officials as members of this group. So I'm not suggesting that the Cabinet Secretary should say when they should be produced, because that's not his remit. But I really do feel that there should be a facilitation. If there's a blockage that they can't proceed to produce the results sooner rather than later, could he use every ounce of the facilities of his office to make sure that any barriers to this group getting on to produce its report to him are removed?
Cabinet Secretary, briefly, please.
Well, I don't think that there are really any barriers. As Mr. Rumbles has rightly said, it is an independent group, and I think I have to be very wary of being seen to, if you like, exert any pressure which might be regarded as inappropriate. I did offer views to the group. They've taken further soundings from Mr. Walker, from others, from the 1.5 degrees a study, and from Dieter Helm. So I think the group wanted, because things have moved on because of COVID and so on, to get more evidence. To be fair to them, I think that was a reasonable approach. rather than just relying on a pre-COVID approach. But I will see if there's anything that in practice we can do to get this moving forward. I'll just finish by making the point that, you know, I think is right for government, we haven't taken the view that we would just do nothing and wait for this report to come along. We've taken the view that we really have to get on with it. And indeed, members have been urging me to do this. And that's what we've done. We've got on with the farmer-led groups. And the other thing, just very briefly, Convener, is that obviously we've got a duty to bring forward a climate change plan. So I haven't been working in isolation. I've been working very closely with my friend and colleague Rosanna Cunningham on producing a climate change plan. And I believe that that's something which is likely to be considered relatively soon. And that obviously does take the overarching strategic approach, which Mr. Rumbles rightly says should be part of our response.
Thank you. The next question is from Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Expanding and following on from Mike Rumble's questions and your responses, can you tell us, Cabinet Secretary, how has the UK government worked with the Scottish Government to ensure Scottish interests are represented in the ongoing future relationship negotiations?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we have had many meetings, and I have participated in many meetings with the UK government, and I've always sought to have a constructive relationship with the four DEFRA cabinet secretaries that have come and gone, or including George Eustace, the current incumbent. But I think it's not unfair to say that the engagement hasn't been meaningful. We haven't been involved in any of the negotiations as we sought, especially fishing, which we'll come on to. We haven't been involved to be in the room, for example, although we asked for that specifically, and Mr. Gove said he would take it away and consider it carefully. He never got back to me. And we haven't been involved in the discussions about trade, about the terms of reference for for various committees. So in general, I think there's been courtesy, there's been lots of interchange, there's been work on frameworks. But the really big decisions, we have asked to be part of that as a sort of partner. But I
don't know if the Cabinet Secretary's frozen or it's his internet connection. Cabinet Secretary, are you there? Cabinet Secretary?
These matters.
Sorry, Angus, the Cabinet Secretary appears to be back. Do you want to ask your next question, please?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Unfortunately, I didn't hear the full response from the Cabinet Secretary, so perhaps he could cover the second half of his response in response to my next question. As you know, we had George Eustace in front of us last week. So can I ask what ongoing engagement is the Scottish Government having with the UK Government regarding the impact of any outcome of the negotiations on this committee's remit? For example, last week the Secretary of State suggested that proposals for support for the sheep sector have been developed, and I think you may have referred to that in your opening remarks. But unfortunately, George Eustace couldn't or was unable to share any detail, saying that it would be further on in the year when detail would be released. So has the Scottish Government been involved in developing that strand of support, for example, and has the detail been shared with the Cabinet Secretary?
Yes, we have. I think it's fair to say that, you know, I have really pressed this issue personally over the last several years. When previously we were looking at the concerns about a Brexit no deal, I pressed the issue with Michael Gove, and he undertook that there would be a compensation scheme throughout the UK if there was a no deal, and tariffs at 40 to 50% were imposed on our EU exports, which form a significant part of the total, because of fear of price collapse. And those proposals were developed. They were never ratified by the Treasury, and I did actually ask Mr. Gove at one of the meetings, how can we have absolute certainty that in a disagreement between yourself and the Treasury, the farmers will win and there will be a sufficient sum of money to compensate sheep farmers throughout the UK? And he said, we will win. He said, we will win. That's what he said. Well, the Treasury still haven't committed, as I understand it, to a specific figure. And let's be quite candid, I think we would all want to avoid a situation where there's tariff, where there's a no deal. That would be a disaster. I mean, Brexit's bad enough, but Brexit with a no deal is utterly catastrophic. So I don't want this to occur. But I do think that, you know, we're very close now. It's a matter of weeks, not months, to the end of the transition period. And therefore, you know, I think the scheme needs to be finalised as between the devolved administrations and the UK government. And we're not quite there yet, although there has been a reasonable amount of work on that at my instigation at these interministerial meetings, where I have pushed it with support from Wales and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Okay. The Secretary of State was bandying about figures last week of £200 on a headage basis for use. I think you mentioned £300 at one point as well. Obviously, we don't want to get farmers and crofters' hopes up if that's the figure that's been looked at. But certainly, as soon as the Scottish Government is aware of the detail, it would be helpful if that could be shared with the committee.
Well, I'll take that away as a specific request. I don't, obviously, Convener, I don't want to start breaching confidences, but I still need to go away and check that. But I'll take that as a request from the committee, and a serious one, and I'll get back to the committee as quickly as we can on that.
Just for clarity, Angus, I think that the figures that he was talking about at that stage were payments in relation to sheep, which could distort internal markets. So I think we need to be really careful about those figures, and it would therefore be really helpful, Cabinet Secretary, if you could clarify. Moving on then to Emma Harper with the next group of questions. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning again, Cabinet Secretary. We've taken evidence in Parliament, but as well as at committee, about there's significant issues with the worry about being ready for Brexit or the end of transition on January the 1st, especially moving produce through ports, for instance, Cairnryan in the southwest of Scotland. And I'm interested to know what work the Scottish Government has done in order to support the movement of our produce from Scotland into Northern Ireland, and then obviously back and forward. We've heard issues around needing 25 extra vets at Larne and Belfast, as well as all the administrative staff. I'm interested to know what work's been done round about Cairnryan. Particularly, I'll probably have some supplementary questions as well.
And Cabinet Secretary, I can let you in, but sorry, Emma, I will let you in with the supplementaries. The question is letting everyone else in as well.
Yep.
Short answers, short questions, always goes down well. Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Emma Harper is right. There will need to be more vets and other staff. We are working on this. There's a lot of detail going on. I don't have the time to go into it. But the basic problem is that the UK government is yet to communicate the requirements of the Northern Ireland Protocol clearly as to how trade is to be regulated between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, bearing in mind that many of the goods that come from the Northern Ireland have actually themselves come from the Republic of Ireland. So this raises a series of complex issues which I'm afraid just haven't been resolved. We do think that in the Scottish Government that there should be a border control post at Cairnryan, and we've made that view very clear to the UK. And of course, the UK should be funding a border post, which is only necessary because of Brexit. You know, they've created the need; they should pay for the cost. All of these things have been left very, very late. But we are seeking to work not only with the UK government, but with Edwin Poots of the Northern Ireland administration as well. And basically, we want to secure frictionless trade continuing between Scotland and Northern Ireland and the Republic indeed, but there simply hasn't been a proper consideration of the necessary preparatory work, including the establishment of a border control post, which will require a new building, planning permission obtained, construction of that new building. There's not enough time for that. So I think that whatever arrangements are required, there will need to be a transitional period during which any changes can be considered properly, and the necessary measures for increased staff of vets and other staff dealing with health certificates and phytosanitary certificates to be recruited and staffed just to deal with the trade. And the worry is that if we don't have that, we might lose out in Scotland, in Larne and Stranraer and the south of Scotland, which Emma Harper represents. So I'm pleased that she has quite rightly raised this important issue today to stand up for the interests of the south of Scotland.
Emma.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. I will be brief, unlike last week actually, but the Cabinet Secretary talks about health certificates and things, and obviously there's going to be issues with digital infrastructure as well. But I'm also interested in how the dairy supply chain will be affected. You mentioned earlier about a dairy stakeholders group being developed, but there's issues around the movement of our dairy produce, the producers, the processors, the whole supply chain is affected, and there are big processors in the southwest of Scotland that move produce back and forward into Northern Ireland, which then goes to south of Ireland. So I would be interested to hear your thoughts on how the dairy supply chain will be impacted after January the 1st. Are they ready?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm afraid I really don't think, I don't mean to be political, Convener, but I just don't think that necessary arrangements have been put in place, and whether that's the dairy sector or indeed the lamb sector, and there's exports of I think nearly 10,000 lambs to Northern Ireland for breeding purposes, and this has been going on for years. And there's now an issue about scrapie and testing for scrapie, and whether whether exports can be permitted actually in accordance with the EU rules, and whether this has even been raised in the negotiations. What I can say is that there is a further meeting of the IMG on Monday, and I will be raising these issues with Mr. Eustace at that meeting, and in fact before. And I did discuss some of these matters yesterday with the National Farmers Union Scotland, Andrew McCormick, who of course himself is from the south of Scotland, and I can't speak for him, but I think they have expressed their concerns about some of these issues as well.
I'm afraid, Emma, we're going to have to move on to further questions from other members. So, Richard Lyle, I think you have some questions now, Richard.
Not that I noted, I'm down 14, Convener. Anyway, I'll ask my question. The Secretary of State outlined the UK Government's commitment to maintain the level of funding for agriculture and stated that Scotland would get 595 million per year throughout this Parliament for Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Does this provide the Scottish Government with the funding guarantees it requires to set out longer-term plans for future policy?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, no, I'm afraid it doesn't. And I set out in my opening remarks the fact that our analysis points to the fact that there will be £170 million of cuts by the UK government compared with the funding we would have received had we remained in the EU. Now, I want to make it clear to members, Convener, that this is a very serious matter. As Mr. Lyle has rightly said, it's not really possible for me to finalise all future spending plans without knowing that the money is there. And the last point I'll make about this, because I don't want to go on, is a very important one. These are concerns shared by the Welsh and Northern Irish administrations. It is not only the Scottish Government that that is seeking restoration of these cuts and the review of the decision made by the HMT without reference to the devolved administrations, it's Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have all jointly together expressed our profound concern at what appears to be a violation of trust engendered by the promises made in Brexit that EU funding would be at least matched. And in that respect, both myself, Edwin Poots and Leslie Griffiths have been as at one in raising these concerns already with George Eustace, and we are continuing to do so, and we will do so on Monday. And if the UK want to argue that they are being fair to the devolved administrations, surely they have to match the EU funding. That was the promise made back in the Brexit referendum, and I really wonder if that promise hadn't been made, if Britain would have voted for Brexit. So this could not be more serious, convener, and I can assure you that I'm pursuing Scotland's interests and those of the rural economy on this matter of paramount importance over the coming weeks and months ahead, with the objective of restoring the funding that was due to Scotland, which we would have received had it not been for Brexit and the UK government's policies on Brexit.
Can I ask what your view is regarding the suggestion that Scotland will lose £170 million of funding due to the UK exit against our wishes?
Well, as I say, I think I have answered that, convener. It's extremely serious. It's unacceptable. It's a matter of fact that this is the cumulative level of cuts, and it's not only Scotland. Wales is similarly affected, and Northern Ireland is.
Oh, we've lost the Cabinet Secretary. Hold on, just. No, we have lost the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, can you hear me? Okay, because we've lost the Cabinet Secretary, I'm going to suspend the meeting briefly as we try to re-establish contact. Could I ask you all please to remain where you are, and the meeting therefore is suspended. I'd like to reconvene the meeting and welcome everyone back. Cabinet Secretary, I'm assuming that you can hear me. And I would actually say that break came at a bad moment, in the sense that we were already up against the time for answering questions, and there are still a lot of questions to go. Richard, I'm going to come back to you because I'm not sure you got the full answer on that, and you might have some other questions that you could succinctly put to the Cabinet Secretary. Richard Lyle.
Yes. Sorry, Convener. The questions, I didn't receive an email really update on questions. Cabinet Secretary, does the Scottish Government have a clear understanding of how the new Trade and Agriculture Commission will operate in relation to Scotland and how it will represent Scotland's interests?
Well, the short answer is no, we don't have sufficient clarity. This is a relatively new venture, but it has been brought forward in part to meet concerns about cheap imports flooding the UK market and undercutting primary food producers in Britain. And I think many farmers are really worried that that's a real risk of trade deals with countries that don't necessarily have the same high environmental and animal welfare standards as apply in the UK. The Trade Commission, I think, is kind of an attempt to to look at these issues, but I don't really think it's actually an effective answer to the real fears and concerns that exist. I think my officials can probably write to you with a bit more detail about the ways in which we are concerned about the formation and the remit and representation on the Commission. So maybe we could do that and write to the committee rather than use up more time now, since time is short.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's me, Convener. I'll let other members in. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard, for that. And yes, Cabinet Secretary, we would like to take you up on that offer to come back on how you see Scotland's interest being reflected in that committee. Now, Peter Chapman, I think you've got some questions you want to ask. Peter.
I have a question on the Continuity Bill, which would provide Scottish ministers with a power to ensure continued alignment with the EU law. Does the Cabinet Secretary have a view on the Secretary of State's comments to the committee last week that keeping pace, as he quoted, won't be a strategy that can be maintained in the long term because it is only a matter of time before the EU would bring forward policy proposals that would be manifestly against Scottish interests, and it then becomes a moot point of do you elevate the pursuit of EU law above the interests of Scotland? I would welcome a comment on that, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think the two worries we have are that the regulation which is applied in the EU generally to the rural economy, whilst it can appear to be cumbersome from time to time, is recognised as necessary to maintain standards in the UK on food production, in processing, in the way we look after animals, and that in turn is seen as essential by most retailers now, because their customers expect that they do not buy food from countries that are mistreating animals and so on and so forth. They also want high sustainability levels, for example, on the marine side. So my worry is that if, and George Eustace has made no secret of the fact he wants to do this, that we start abandoning all these high standards, then we might actually be very quickly causing real commercial damage, because the retailers won't change their standards. And also, that in turn may threaten our export market to Europe, because if we lower our standards, they're not going to be happy with that. And therefore, we set at risk much of our exports. And the second concern relates to the concerns that the powers that we have over fishing and farming in particular, I think, are at serious risk of being predated by the UK government. I'm already seeing early signs in fishing that this is happening, and that UK officials seem to think that it's for them to take decisions on devolved issues. And I'm raising this with George Eustace on Monday. And I'm extremely concerned about that. And therefore, those are the two concerns that I've got, or two main concerns that I have to answer Mr. Chapman's question.
It's all predicated on the fact that you believe that we would be lower in standards. Can you not understand that very often the standards in the UK are ahead of the standards in the EU on many occasions as far as animal welfare is concerned and environmental issues? So I don't understand your argument that we are focused on lowering standards.
Well, the reason I'm concerned about that, convener, is very simply that many fellow members of the Conservative Party and serious members in government have made comments to the effect that they are intent on reducing, as they see it, the red tape and bureaucracy, as they would term it. So it's members of Mr. Chapman's own party that have raised these concerns, and I think from various utterances that I could quote, actually, convener, but I think I'd be just using up time to maybe delve into political matters. But I think the concerns are very real, that members of the Conservative cabinet in the UK have clearly indicated that they want to reduce standards across a whole area of waste because they see them as inappropriate. So, I do think my concerns are grounded on fact.
Right, we'll move on, Cabinet Secretary. What has been the nature of the engagement between the UK and Scottish Parliaments on the future fisheries agreement with the EU and on coordination on fisheries matters across the UK?
Well, I should say, firstly, that there always has been a good relationship between officials because they work, I think, more closely, arguably, than most, if not all, other officials because of the annual fishing talks in Brussels, where, incidentally, in many years we secured quite a good outcome for the Scottish fishing sector. But the relations with the UK government have unfortunately not followed suit because, despite repeated requests, Scottish government officials were denied the opportunity to participate in the talks about a future fisheries agreement. And I myself put this request directly to Michael Gove at a meeting that took place at Buckie not so very long ago. And he said he would take away this request, but we never heard from him on that. And despite the fact that, and Alan Gibb is here to give evidence as required, despite the fact that, without embarrassing Mr. Gibb, he is regarded in Europe as one of the foremost exponents of negotiation and experts in the technicalities of the fisheries negotiations. His expertise, his knowledge, his trust built up over many years with the leading exponents of the fishing industry in Scotland, he has been kept out of the room and is simply briefed about what has taken place in the room afterwards. I think that's an opportunity missed to get the best deal for Scotland. And the real risk now, in the next couple of weeks, is that some last-minute shady deal is done by Mr. Frost or whoever it is in the UK side without reference to Scotland, and it has unforeseen, unintended adverse consequences in Scotland. But on a ministerial level, I'm afraid there just hasn't been the engagement, and that has been the case as well with third-party negotiations, Norway, Faroes, Iceland. We have been cut out of these negotiations. This is just a very foolish approach because, frankly, the Scottish officials have the knowledge about Scottish fishing interests. I'm afraid the UK officials just don't have the same degree of knowledge, probably because it's not their direct responsibility, and therefore they're not so familiar with the highly complex issues involved. And this is extremely unfortunate and potentially very damaging.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I have to say that because of the length of that answer, I'm afraid that the two members want to come in, but I can't let them come in. So I would ask everyone just to consciously be mindful of other members. So we're going to have to move on to the next question, which is Colin Smith. You've got some questions, Colin.
Thank you very much, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, can I turn to two pieces of important UK legislation? The Fisheries Bill, obviously now an Act as of last week, and the Internal Market Bill. Firstly, on the Fisheries Act, the Act replaces the Common Fisheries Policy, Article 17, with the National Benefit Objective. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how he foresees this being different, and what criteria the Scottish Government will use for the objective to ensure that fishing opportunities are distributed to those who deliver the best socio-economic and environmental objectives?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, my kind of view about this is that the Fisheries Bill produces a framework, and the framework in itself is it's not perfect, but it's workable. That's not really the issue. The issue is that I think that the early signs are that the UK government, in the discussions that are taking place, in the work that's being done to work out a bilateral deal, that the DEFRA seem to be taking on the mantle of being, if you like, a new commission, instead of a partnership of equals. And bear in mind, of course, Scotland's fishery is much more valuable than the English fishery. It's by far bigger than the English fishery. But despite that, the early signs are that the UK government seems to regard itself as the boss, the commission, if you like. This is seriously worrying for me. On the technical matters, Convener, I don't know if Mr Gibb would have an opportunity to come in. I'm sorry we lost so much time when the Blue Jean system apparently failed, but I would welcome, I think it would be useful if Mr Gibb could give his comments at some stage about these matters.
I'm happy to let Mr Gibb come in, but I do caution everyone, just please be mindful that we want everyone to get a crack at this. So, Mr Gibb.
Thank you, Convener. I'll be brief. I would just add to the Cabinet Secretary's remarks and point the committee to the future fisheries management process that we're going through, where we are very clear in that strategy that we will look to allocate fishing opportunities and any additional in a way that ensures that it goes to active fishermen all benefit across all communities in Scotland, allowing for diversity. The employment opportunities at the heart really is how we will adapt to the revised Article 7 Member refers to.
That wasn't entirely satisfactory because you broke up all the way through it. So, Cabinet Secretary, we can try and bring him in at a later stage, but it looks like you may be on your own for a bit. Colin, do you want to have a further question?
Given the internet problems, maybe it would be helpful for the government to write to us just specifically on that national benefit objective. May be quite helpful. But Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned that the UK Act isn't perfect. So can I ask, is it still the government's plan to use the UK Act effectively to manage Scottish fisheries in perpetuity, or are you still committed to what was your manifesto commitment of a Scottish inshore fisheries bill, albeit I appreciate that won't happen in this Parliament? And just as a small aside, how will Parliament debate these issues? We're used to, for example, this time of year, an annual fisheries debate. How will we take that forward as a Parliament in order to discuss and debate some of these important issues?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think Mr Smith raises a number of very fair points. Parliament, it's up to Parliament how it wishes to conduct proceedings, but I would expect that there will and there must be opportunities to debate fishing in the future, obviously. And indeed, I very much hope to bring forward a ministerial statement on fisheries management and the analysis that we had of our consultation on our discussion paper. And Mr Gibb did allude to some of the proposals. There's many others. Fishing is devolved. It must remain devolved. We must make decisions in Scotland. Obviously, we will work with the UK government, but the early sign is that the DEFRA seems to be taking on the role of the Commission and a kind of unilateral arbitrator on domestic management decisions. This completely cuts across devolved competencies. On the inshore matter that Mr Smith mentioned, I think it's fair to say that, after a break because of COVID and interruption, the installation of remote electronic monitoring equipment is now beginning to be delivered, and that, I think, will address many of the serious issues that have been raised with parliamentarians about inshore fisheries. We are absolutely committed to helping local management of inshore fisheries, to build on the efforts that exist already. Where the local management arrangements work well, they work very well, and there's good examples of that. And the CIFA is the organisation that I meet with regularly, with well-respected fishing leaders who are representing their communities. And I think that practical work, Mr. Smith, is actually probably, of more critical importance in the short term, particularly the REM delivery. And we've also established a NEFROPS task force because of the serious problems facing the prawn sector, and also the loss of the brown crab market in China. And we have also, I think, delivered compensation, financial support during COVID to fishing interests, starting off with those with the smaller boats. And we have made a fair effort at providing that support to provide a lifeline for businesses to get through. And I think it is fair to say that the inshore shellfish sector has been that which has been most affected adversely during COVID, and also is worried about loss of markets in Brexit as well, and loss of the absolutely essential European markets.
Colin, you want to come back?
Obviously, they'll turn into the internal market bill, Cabinet Secretary. As you know, Clause 2 of the bill on mutual recognition provides that goods, for example, produced in Scotland or indeed imported to Scotland can then be sold to any other part of the UK without having to adhere to any additional requirements regarding regulations in that part of the UK. And the non-discrimination principle of that bill means that a producer in Scotland shouldn't be affected by those regulatory requirements elsewhere in the UK. Can I ask Cabinet Secretary how he believes that will impact on the government's pursuit of its rural policy objectives? The Secretary of State last week told this committee that he believes that the sort of looser regulation would actually be something that would be beneficial to Scotland.
Briefly, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we are worried that the internal market bill will kind of open the door to a race to the bottom on food standards and environmental standards. I've said that already. So we do have that substantial concern. And we are also concerned that the non-discrimination principle of the bill will constrain our ability to make devolved choices. I mean, I could give examples, but I think it would take too long. And again, there are some technical aspects, and I'm very happy to share more of them with the committee if time, since time probably doesn't permit now. But I think the overriding concern is that, as the announcement yesterday indicated, that the UK wants to stop paying farmers to farm food. And as in Scotland, we think that farmers should be paid for the hard work they do to earn our financial support, not subsidy support, for the work they do in producing food as well as the environment. I think there's now a clear divergence between Scotland and England. England want to abandon farmers as food producers. We don't. We want to value them and recognise that. And the question then is, will the finance continue to be available?
Cabinet Secretary, I've given you a huge amount of leeway, and, you know, agriculture is devolved, and it's a devolved matter for the Scottish Government to sort out. So, therefore, you know, going into the political aspects like that, I don't think is entirely helpful. But, Colin, do you have a further question? Right, then I'm going to move to the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt, who's got a series of questions, I think, Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. This committee heard from the UK Government that there will be a need, there will need to be a stated framework to address potentially market distorting subsidies, but this will principally be dealt with through the common frameworks. What's your view of such a state aid framework, and are you confident about the ability of the Scottish Government to run an agricultural support scheme tailored to the needs of the Scottish agricultural sector within UK state aid rules?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as I understand it, the provisions of the Internal Market Bill mean that the UK ministers could put in place new subsidy controls that would make unlawful payments that we would otherwise have been able to make So that could have a negative impact. And a one-size-fits-all framework, as I just alluded to, for agricultural support could prevent us from making payments to farmers that I think represent the value that they provide to society. And I'm particularly worried about our ability to continue with LFAS or some variant of it for the hill farmers, because other parts of the UK have dropped that 7 or 8 years ago, I think. So there are particular concerns. It's difficult to be categoric at the moment as to how this will all pan out, but I'm primarily concerned, and this is not a political point, that we do need to value the rural economy and continue to supply that funding. And if the funding is not to be maintained in the long term, I think that would threaten many small farms and crofts that really rely on getting that support, financial support for the hard work that they do and for what they produce for the country.
I mean, it has been recognised that there is a need for common approaches to maintain the UK internal market. I mean, what's the Scottish Parliament's role, do you think, in this process, and how would we be able to effectively scrutinise that? And is it possible that, indeed, that the UK Internal Market Bill could constrain the role of the Scottish Parliament? So, for example, if we were to disagree on some particular area that was a devolved area, could Scottish ministers bring forward separate legislation? And, with the Internal Market Bill, is this going to be legally permitted? In other words, are the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament's ability to make its own law for Scottish agriculture and fisheries going to be severely detrimented by the UK Internal Market Bill?
Well, I think these are risks. I mean, whether these risks become realities, we must wait and see. But I think there are serious grounds to indicate that there are concerns. And, bear in mind, I've just mentioned LFAS. We have made different decisions in Scotland. Agriculture has been devolved for about 20 years. Many of the decisions taken in Scotland haven't actually been politically controversial in Scotland, like supporting hill farmers. But they wouldn't be decisions that would be taken by a UK government, I don't think. So I think there are real risks here. I don't want to be alarmist about this because, my job is to get the best for the rural economy, whatever, frankly, the wider macro picture is. But my main concern is about finance, and secondly, about being able to shape our own policies here in Scotland. As for the Parliament, I think the Parliament should robustly stand up for its powers. Robustly stand up for its powers. And Mr Russell has been leading the campaign about concerns that the UK's governments would result in predation of those powers. I've seen for myself, this is not a fanciful worry. This is happening right now in fisheries. And I'm going to do my best to stop it and stamp it out right now. But if I can't do that, my goodness me, I expect the Parliament will take on the mantle very quickly.
Just one further question. We all know the benefit that leader funding has been to many rural communities. I understand from last week's session with the Minister that leader funding will now become a strand of the Shared Prosperity Fund, which we've not heard anything about, but which seems to be a fund that will be able to fund everything and anything. When you do have this meeting next week, can you please try and get some more clarity about how leader funding will be replaced?
Well, I should say yes, but I'm not sure that I will, because I've been asking this question for the past 3 years. And so far, the only thing we know about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is those 4 words. We only know its title. There was supposed to be a consultation. So, I mean, the leader is an absolutely essential programme for communities. I think that's a cross-party approach, and we all know examples in our own patches. But, I mean, as far as the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, it's becoming like a sad joke at the moment. I mean, there's about as much evidence and facts available the UK government's plans about this UK Shared Prosperity Fund as there is an evidential basis to the source of funding of Santa Claus's largesse?
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
I think that probably ends the session, Cabinet Secretary. I'm just thinking after that whether Santa Claus would come and visit you. Possibly not. But on the basis that we've come to the end of our questions, I'd like to thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and Alan for attending the meeting, albeit that Alan's internet connection let him down at the critical moment. But thank you. And we now move on to agenda item 11, which is the European Union Withdrawal Act. We have received a consent notification in relation to one UK statutory instrument as detailed on the agenda. This instrument is being laid in the UK Parliament in relation to the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. This instrument has been classified as Category A. No issues have been raised on this instrument. My question to the committee is, does the committee agree to write to the Scottish Government to confirm it is content for consent for the UK SI referred to in the notification to be given? I'm just looking around the room. I'm seeing nods. We are agreed. We will now move into private session. Thank you.